Hey everybody! Welcome to today's video, where we are going to look at the curve to mesh node. We're going to look at a few different ways we can use this node in our scenes and animations. And we'll create a simple animation using this node at the end. Let's first bring up a Geometry Nodes window and create a new Geometry Nodes modifier for our default cube. And we can go ahead and add our curve to mesh node here. We don't see any change yet, so let's go ahead and add a profile curve. Let's use a curved circle. And still we see no change. Well, this has a simple explanation. The curve to mesh node will only work on a curve object. We can go ahead and remove our group input node. Let's bring in another curved circle for our main curve. And now we can see the effect. Because we are using the curved circle, we are essentially creating a mesh tube where the main curve exists. We can also scale our profile curve down if we want this mesh to have a smaller radius. The important thing to note here is that the profile curve does not just have to be a circle, even though that is most often used. For example, let's add a star for our profile curve. And this is a really large profile curve, but definitely a cool effect. Let's take a look at our next input, scale. Scale is brand new to this node with the latest release of Blender, which is 4.5 at the time of this recording. Another interesting thing we can do with scale is to bring in a random value node. This gives us a pretty wild spiky shape, but we can also adjust this a bit. Let's move our min and max values closer together so that we have less variance in our values. Another thing we can do is to remove the amount of vertices in our curved circle, which gives us a much more subtle change in values. Let's try swapping our star curve for a spiral instead. We can adjust the rotation value for our spiral, but we don't really see much of a change since the spirals will be internal. We can also adjust the start and end radius to see some difference. Let's go ahead and bump our circle vertices back up to 32. We can go ahead and remove our star and spiral now. And let's look at bringing in a custom curve, which we can also use for our profile curve. We can just drag it into our geometry node editor and hook it up like any other node. And let's take a look at the custom curve by itself. We can see it's a fairly simple pattern, although you can certainly use more complex curves for your profile curve. So let's go back and look at our curved circle now. Next, we're going to look at the fill cap input. We won't be able to see any difference with our current setup, so let's bring in a curved line. See how the ends are empty, forming a tube? If we check the fill caps, then the ends are filled in, and we can adjust our line as we like to change the look of our mesh. Let's go ahead and take out our custom curve and add back our spiral. We'll be able to see it much better on a curved line. Now we can see the changes better when we adjust the rotations and the start and end radii. So let's bring back our curved circle profile and remove these nodes. Now we're going to see how we can use this with a mesh object. Let's bring in an icosphere. And when we hook it up, we still just see an icosphere. But let's see what happens when we bring in a meshed curve first. And that's cool. We now have a wireframe icosphere. And as we increase these subdivisions, we can see more bars appear across our icosphere. Let's also bring down the radius of our profile curve. Why does this work when we seem to just be converting to curve and then back to mesh? Let's take a look at how our object looks right after we converted to curves. We can see that each edge in our original mesh becomes a curve. So if we think about each of those curves being turned to a mesh, it makes more sense. Let's turn off the viewer and go back to our full object. And we can do the same thing with any mesh. Let's bring in a cylinder. And we'll plug that into our meshed curve node. We can adjust these side segments and see that they automatically become wireframe segments as well. Now let's remove this and look at another type of object, text. We'll bring in a string to curves node. We can plug that directly into the curve to mesh node. Let's set our text value to node life. And let's view this from above using numpad 7. Now let's move over to the shader editor. While we have the world in scope, let's turn the background black. Then we can switch over to object mode. And we'll add a light blue color. Actually, I wanted to make this emissive, so let's set it down here. And let's dial the emission up to around 6.5 or 7. The higher this value, the closer to white the emission color will appear. Now we can switch back to our geometry nodes editor. And let's add a set material node and set it to our blue material we just created. We can also change our font. You can use any font you like, but there's one that I particularly like that looks a lot more like a neon sign. It's called Harlow Solid Italic. My computer had it by default, but if you're looking for it, you can download it at the link below. And that looks pretty cool, but let's go ahead and animate it. We'll move our string to curves node over here so we have some space. I have 150 frames set up here, and let's make sure we are on frame 0. Next we'll add a trim curve node. We're going to set the end value to 0, and let's keyframe that. Next, let's move to frame 100, and then keyframe that value back at 1. Now, if we let that run, we can see the text appearing as our trim curve value increases. Before you render, make sure your camera is directly above the text. You can set the camera to the current view using Ctrl-Alt-Numpad 0. Now let's go ahead and render our animation. And now we can see our text animation. It's pretty neat, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video and found it useful and informative. Please give me a like and subscribe if you'd like to help support my channel. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I wish you all a very happy blendering.